The audition hall of the Moscow Conservatory smelled like old wood and nervous sweat. It was one of those places where dreams came to die more often than they came true. The ceiling stretched up so high that even a whisper seemed to echo. Making every wrong note sound twice as bad, Alina sat in the very last row of wooden chairs, trying to make herself as small as possible. She was 17, but if you looked at her, you might think she was 14 or 15. Her glasses were too big for her face and kept sliding down her nose every few minutes. She'd push them back up with one finger, a habit she'd had since she was little. The dress she wore was navy blue and simple, bought from a second-hand shop back home. It was clean and pressed, but you could tell it had been worn by someone else first. The hem had been let down at least twice, leaving faint lines in the fabric. Around her, the other candidates were doing what musicians do before auditions. Some paced back and forth, their expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor. Others practiced scales and runs, their instruments singing out confidently. There was a boy near the front who kept playing the same flashy passage over and over, his bow flying across the strings like he was trying to impress everyone in the room before he even got on stage. A girl with perfect posture and a dress that probably cost more than Elena's entire wardrobe sat reviewing her sheet music, her face calm and composed. Elena just sat there. Her violin case rested against her knees, old and battered with stickers peeling off the sides. Some were from her hometown in Siberia, a place most people in Moscow had never heard of. Others were cartoon characters her grandmother had stuck on years ago to make her smile. She hadn't taken them off. Her fingers trembled slightly as she gripped the handle of the case. Every few minutes, she'd take a deep breath, hold it, and let it out slowly. It didn't help much. At the front of the hall, behind a long table, sat the panel of judges. There were 4 of them, but everyone knew only one really mattered. Maestro Victor Orlov sat in the center, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile sometime in the last century. He wore a dark suit and a tie that was slightly loosened, as if he'd already had a long day. Papers were stacked in front of him, and he reviewed them with the kind of focus that made you think he could see right through to your soul. Victor Orlov wasn't just any teacher or conductor. He was a legend. 30 years ago, he'd been the youngest conductor ever appointed to lead a major orchestra. Since then, he'd discovered 3 violinists who were now household names in the classical music world. People said he could hear something special within the first 30 seconds of someone playing. They also said he could hear when someone had no business holding an instrument, and he wasn't shy about telling them so. There were stories of students who'd left his auditions in tears, their dreams crushed by a few words from his mouth. He didn't do it to be cruel. He just believed in honesty, even when it hurt. The number system was simple. Each candidate had been given a number when they arrived. They went in order. Alina was number 43. She'd been sitting in that chair for almost 3 hours now, watching person after person walk up to the stage, play their piece, and then walk back down. Some left smiling. Most didn't. The boy who'd been practicing that flashy passage had gone up about an hour ago. He'd played well, technically perfect even. But Maestro Orlov had barely nodded before writing something down and calling the next number. The girl with the expensive dress had played beautifully, her tone rich and warm, but she'd gotten the same response. A nod, some writing. Next number, please. Alina had watched all of it. With each performance, her heart beat a little faster. Her palms got a little more sweaty. She wiped them on her dress every few minutes, leaving slightly damp marks on the fabric. The violin case felt heavier with each passing hour, like it was trying to root itself to the floor so she wouldn't have to go up there. She thought about her grandmother. Babushka would have told her to sit up straight, to hold her head high, to remember who she was and where she came from. But Babushka wasn't here anymore. She'd been gone for 2 years now, and Alina still felt the empty space she'd left behind. Sometimes, late at night in their small apartment back home, Alina would wake up and forget for a moment that her grandmother was gone. She'd start to call out to her before remembering that the other room was empty now. Finally, after what felt like forever, a voice called out her number. 43. Alina stood up, and her legs felt like they might give out. She picked up her case with both hands and started walking toward the stage. The distance couldn't have been more than 30 meters, but it felt like kilometers. Her shoes, also secondhand but polished until they shined, made soft clicking sounds on the floor. Everyone else's footsteps had sounded confident. Hers sounded like apologies. As she walked, she could feel eyes on her. The other remaining candidates watched. The judges watched. Maestro Orlov glanced up from his papers, took in her appearance with one quick look, and then glanced back down. She could almost read his thoughts. Another small-town kid with big dreams and little talent. Another rejection he'd have to deliver before lunch. Alina climbed the 3 steps up to the stage. The platform was raised just enough to make everyone in the audience look up at you. It was designed that way on purpose, to put the performer in the spotlight, to test how they handled pressure. Under the bright stage lights, Alina felt even more exposed than before. She could see dust particles floating in the air, caught in the beams of light. She set her case down carefully and opened it. The velvet inside was faded and worn. Her violin lay there, and even from the judges' table, you could see it had seen better days. There were scratches on the wood, places where the varnish had worn away from years of handling. A crack near the bottom had been carefully glued and reinforced. This wasn't an instrument worth thousands of dollars like the ones the other students had carried. This was a working violin, a survivor, much like Alina herself. She lifted it out gently, the way you'd lift something precious and fragile. In her hands, despite its worn appearance, the violin seemed to fit perfectly. She'd been holding this instrument since she was 7 years old. It had been her grandmother's before it was hers, and her great-aunt's before that. The wood remembered generations of hands, generations of music. Alina positioned the violin under her chin and raised her bow. For just a moment, she stood there in starting position. The hall went quiet. Even the other candidates stopped their nervous movements. Maestro Orlov's pen was already hovering over his notepad, ready to write his assessment. His face showed nothing, but his posture said everything. He was already preparing his rejection speech, already thinking about the next candidate. Alina took one more breath. Then, so quietly you almost couldn't hear it, she began to play. The first notes that came from Alina's violin were so soft that the judge sitting on the far left leaned forward in her chair. She tilted her head slightly, straining to hear. It wasn't that Alina was playing badly or timidly. It was something else. The sound was deliberate, controlled, like she was sharing a secret with the room rather than trying to fill it with noise. Maestro Orlov barely glanced up. His pen touched the paper, ready to write. He'd heard this before, this quiet opening from nervous students who lacked the confidence to really play. Give it 30 seconds, he thought. Maybe less. Then he'd thank her politely and call the next number. He had 12 more auditions to get through before the day was done. His back was starting to ache from sitting in that chair for so long. The piece Alina had chosen was Paganini's Caprice, number 24. If you know anything about violin music, you know that's either very brave or very foolish. Paganini wrote it to show off, to prove he could do things on the violin that other people said were impossible. It's fast, it's complicated, and it's absolutely unforgiving. One small mistake and everyone knows. Most students avoided it at auditions because the risk was too high. The smart ones picked something beautiful but safer, something that would show their skills without exposing their weaknesses. But Alina wasn't playing it the way most people did. She started with the theme, the main melody, and she played it like a lullaby, like something her grandmother might have hummed while cooking dinner or folding laundry. The notes floated out into the hall, gentle and sweet, almost fragile. For the first 20 seconds, Maestro Orlov kept his eyes on his paper. He wrote the date at the top. He wrote her candidate number. His pen moved to write his first comment, probably something about lacking stage presence or needing more confidence. Standard feedback for a nervous student, then something changed. The soft notes began to grow. Not louder exactly, but deeper, fuller. Alina's bows started moving faster across the strings, and suddenly the gentleness was building into something else. It was like watching a small stream turn into a river, slow at first, then faster, then impossible to stop. The technique that had been hidden under those quiet opening notes started to reveal itself. Maestro Orlov's pen stopped moving. He looked up. Elena's fingers on the fingerboard were starting to dance. That's the only word for it. They moved so quickly, so precisely, that if you blinked, you'd miss the transitions. Her left hand was executing passages that usually took students months to learn, and she was making them look easy. The double stops, where you play two strings at once, were perfectly in tune. The runs up and down the neck were clean and clear, each note distinct even at high speed. But it wasn't just the technical skill that made Maestro Orlov sit back in his chair. It was the feeling behind it. Every note meant something. Every phrase had a purpose. This wasn't a girl trying to impress judges with fancy fingerwork. This was someone who understood the music, who felt it in her bones, was telling a story with each movement of her bow. The other judges noticed too. The woman on the left had stopped writing entirely and was just watching. The man next to Maestro Orlov took off his glasses and leaned forward. The fourth judge, a younger teacher who'd been checking his phone between candidates all morning, actually set the phone down on the table. Elena herself seemed completely unaware of the effect she was having. Her eyes had closed about a minute into the piece. Her body moved with the music, swaying slightly, her shoulders rising and falling with the phrases. The nervousness that had been so obvious when she walked onto the stage had disappeared completely. In its place was something else. Focus. Joy. Pure connection with what she was playing. The piece moved into one of its most difficult sections. There's a part in Caprice 24 where the left hand has to play a melody while also plucking other strings with the fingers. A technique called pizzicato. It's hard enough to do slowly. At tempo, it's nearly impossible. Most professional violinists spend hours just on that section alone. Elena hit it perfectly. Her fingers plucked the bass notes while simultaneously bowing the melody line, creating two voices that wove together like a conversation. The sound filled the hall now, no longer quiet but commanding, powerful. This was the part of the piece where Paganini himself would have grinned at the audience, showing off what he could do. Maestro Orlov did something he hadn't done in 15 years of running auditions. He stood up. His chair scraped against the floor, and the sound echoed in the hall. The other judges turned to look at him, surprised. One of them opened her mouth as if to ask what was wrong, but he held up a hand. His eyes never left Elena on the stage. He walked around the table and stood in front of it, arms crossed, watching intently. His expression had changed from bored disinterest to something else. Disbelief, maybe? Or recognition. Like he was seeing something he thought he'd never see again. Elena moved into another impossible section, ricochet bowing where the bow literally bounces off the strings in controlled jumps. It sounds like raindrops or bird wings, quick and light. Most students made it sound choppy or uneven. Elena made it sound like the most natural thing in the world. Each bounce was exactly the right length, the right pressure, creating a cascade of notes that seemed to shimmer in the air. The judge who'd been on her phone fumbled for it again, but not to check messages. She opened the camera app and started recording. Her hands shook slightly as she tried to frame the shot. She didn't want to miss this. Whatever this was, it needed to be documented. In the back of the hall, the remaining candidates had stopped their warm-up exercises entirely. They stood or sat frozen, watching Elena play. A few of them had their mouths slightly open. One boy, who'd been confident and cocky all morning, now looked slightly sick. He'd played well during his audition, technically solid, exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd trained at a prestigious prep school. But this was something different entirely. Elena's worn violin, with its scratches and its carefully repaired crack, was singing. That's what it sounded like. Not just playing notes or executing techniques, but actually singing, the way a human voice does when it's expressing something too deep for words. The instrument vibrated with the sound, and you could see the wood responding to her touch, like it was alive and happy to be making music again. The piece built and built, climbing toward its climax. Elena's bow arm moved with incredible speed and control. Her fingers flew across the fingerboard. Sweat had started to form on her forehead, making her glasses slip down slightly. but she didn't stop to push them up. She was completely lost in the music now, in another world entirely. Maestro Orlov uncrossed his arms and put one hand over his mouth. His eyes had widened. In his decades of teaching and conducting, he'd heard thousands of violinists. Brilliant ones, talented ones, technically perfect ones. But something about what he was hearing now made his chest feel tight. This wasn't just talent. This wasn't just years of practice, though clearly those were there too. This was something else. Something rare. Something real. Alina approached the final passages of the piece. The ones that separated the very good from the truly exceptional. Her face showed the effort now, the concentration, but also something like happiness. Like this, right here, was exactly where she was supposed to be. The final section of Caprice 24 is where most violinists either prove themselves or fall apart. It's a series of rapid-fire variations that test everything you've got. Speed, accuracy, tone, stamina. Your fingers have to move faster than seems humanly possible while still hitting every note perfectly in tune. Your bow arm has to stay controlled even when your muscles are screaming from the effort. And somehow, through all of that, you still have to make it sound like music and not just an athletic exercise. Alina attacked it with a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Her bow flew across the strings and patterns, so complex they almost didn't make sense. Down bow, up bow, string crossings that happen in fractions of a second. Her left-hand fingers hammered down on the fingerboard with precision, finding each note without hesitation. There was no fumbling, no searching. She knew exactly where every note lived on that instrument. But here's what made Maestro Orlov take 3 steps closer to the stage. It wasn't just that Alina could play these impossible passages. Plenty of students could do that with enough practice and determination. What made his breath catch in his throat was that she made them sound natural, effortless even. Like this was just how music was supposed to flow from a violin, as easy as breathing or speaking. The technique she was using shouldn't have been possible for someone her age. That's what kept running through his mind. He'd been teaching for 40 years. He knew what 17-year-old violinists sounded like, even the gifted ones. They had raw talent, sure, and energy and passion. But they lacked the depth of understanding that only came from decades of study. They hadn't lived enough life to put real soul into pieces like this. Their playing was impressive, but somehow still young, still developing. Alina didn't sound young. She sounded like someone who'd been playing for 50 years, like someone who'd experienced joy and loss and everything in between and was now pouring all of it into the music. Each phrase had weight to it, meaning the fast passages weren't just showing off. They were expressing something urgent, something that needed to be said quickly. The slow moments, when they came, held entire worlds of emotion. The female judge who'd started recording was now standing too, trying to keep her phone steady. Her hand trembled slightly. In her 20 years of teaching at the conservatory, she'd never seen anything quite like this. She'd heard students play this piece 100 times. Some played it faster. Some played it with fewer mistakes. But none of them had ever played it like it mattered this much. Like the music itself depended on getting every single note. Every single phrase, exactly right. Alina's body moved with the music in ways that couldn't be taught. When the melody soared upward, her shoulders lifted. When it dove down into the lower registers, she leaned into the instrument. Her bow arm extended fully on the long notes, drawing out every bit of sound the strings could give. On the short bouncing notes, her movements became quick and precise. Like a bird's wings, the other candidates in the back had completely forgotten about their own auditions. They stood in a small cluster now, watching in silence. A couple of them had expressions that looked almost like pain. They'd worked so hard to get here, practiced for years, dreamed of impressing Maestro Orlov, and now they were watching someone who was operating on a completely different level. It was humbling and inspiring and devastating all at once. One girl, who'd played quite well during her own audition an hour earlier, felt tears prickling at her eyes. Not from sadness exactly, but from the sheer beauty of what she was hearing. She'd never heard anyone their age play like this. She'd never heard most professionals play like this. It was the kind of performance that reminded you why you fell in love with music in the first place. Before all the competition and pressure and judgment, Maestro Orlov was now standing at the edge of the stage, close enough that he could see every detail. He watched Elena's fingers, trying to understand how she was accomplishing what she was accomplishing. The left-hand pizzicato she'd executed earlier, where you pluck strings with your left hand while bowing with your right, was a technique that took years to master. Most students couldn't do it cleanly until they were in their 20s. Elena had done it perfectly, like it was second nature. But it was more than just technique. He could see it in the way she held the instrument, the way she breathed with the phrases, the way her whole body was involved in making the sound. This was someone who didn't just play the violin. This was someone who lived it, who understood it on a level that went beyond notes on a page or finger positions or bow strokes. His mind raced back. Through decades of auditions and performances, he'd discovered 3 virtuosos, students who'd gone on to play in the world's greatest concert halls. He'd heard them when they were young, just starting out, and he'd recognized something special in each of them. But even they hadn't sounded like this at 17. They'd been brilliant. Yes. Promising, absolutely. But still rough around the edges. Still learning who they were as musicians. Elena sounded fully formed, complete. Like she'd already found her voice and knew exactly what she wanted to say with it. Piece was building toward its conclusion now. The final sprint to the finish line. This was where tired muscles usually betrayed even good students. The bow arm would start to lose control. The fingers would miss a few notes. The tone would thin out from exhaustion. It was understandable. This piece was physically demanding in ways that people who didn't play violin couldn't imagine. It was like running a sprint while solving math problems and reciting poetry at the same time. Elena showed no signs of fatigue. If anything, she seemed to be gaining strength as she went. Her sound got bigger, fuller, more powerful. The violin sang out now, filling every corner of the audition hall. The rickety old instrument with its visible crack and worn varnish was producing a sound that would have made expensive concert violins jealous. She hit the final runs, fingers cascading up and down the fingerboard in patterns that blurred together. Each note was still clear, still perfectly in tune, still part of the greater musical story she was telling. Her bow moved so fast, it almost disappeared, just a streak of motion and horsehair and wood. And then suddenly, she was in the home stretch. The last few measures, the final statement of the theme that brought everything full circle. Elena played it with the same gentleness she'd started with, like she was closing a book and setting it carefully back on the shelf. The loudness and power of the middle sections gave way to something quieter again, something intimate. She drew the bow across the strings for the final note, letting it ring out into the hall. The sound sustained, pure and clear, then gradually faded into silence. Elena held her position for a moment, bow still touching the strings, eyes still closed. The last vibrations of sound died away. Then there was nothing. Complete silence. Not even the sound of breathing. The entire audition hall seemed to be holding its breath. Caught in the spell of what they'd just witnessed, Elena's eyes opened slowly, like she was waking up from a dream. The trance broke. She came back to herself, back to the reality of where she was. The stage lights were bright in her eyes. Her glasses had slipped almost all the way down her nose. There was a slight dampness on her forehead from the effort. She lowered her violin and looked out at the judges. The nervousness came flooding back immediately. Her shoulders hunched forward again. She seemed to shrink a little, becoming that small, scared girl who'd walked onto the stage minutes earlier. Had it been good enough? Had she made mistakes? The piece had felt right while she was playing it, but now she wasn't sure. Maybe she'd rushed some parts. Maybe her intonation had been off. Maybe they'd hated it. The judges stared back at her. None of them moved. None of them spoke. The female judge still had her phone up, recording, her mouth slightly open. The others sat frozen, like they'd been turned to stone. Maestro Orlov stood at the edge of the stage, closer to Elena than judges were supposed to get during auditions. He looked at her face, then at the battered violin in her hands, then back at her face. His expression was unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he did something that no one in that room had ever seen him do before. Something that would be talked about for years afterward. He stepped forward and climbed up onto the stage itself. The sound of Maestro Orlov's shoes on the stage floor echoed through the silent hall. One step, then another, then a third. Elena's eyes went wide. Her grip on the violin tightened like she was afraid someone might take it from her. In all the stories she'd heard about these auditions, in all the advice she'd read online from former students, no one had ever mentioned the maestro walking onto the stage. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. You played, he wrote notes, he said thank you, and you left. That was the system. But here he was, standing right in front of her. Up close, he looked older than he had from the back row. There were deep lines around his eyes and mouth. Marks of a lifetime spent frowning in concentration or squinting at musical scores. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, like he'd run his hands through it too many times during the long morning of auditions. His dark eyes studied her face with an intensity that made Elena want to look away, but she didn't. She couldn't. He glanced down at the violin in her hands, really looked at it. The scratches that crisscrossed the wood, the worn places where countless hands had gripped the neck over the years, the crack near the bottom that had been so carefully repaired you could only see it if you knew where to look. The strings were old, probably due to be changed weeks ago. The bridge sat at a slight angle that suggested it had been adjusted. Many times to keep the instrument played, this was not an instrument that belonged in the Moscow Conservatory. This was not the kind of violin that serious students played. The other candidates had brought instruments worth more than cars, some of them worth more than houses. Violins made by famous makers, or at least good modern copies. Instruments with perfect varnish and pristine condition, kept in climate-controlled cases and insured for ridiculous amounts of money. Elena's violin looked like it had lived a hard life. But Maestro Orlov's expression as he studied it wasn't one of contempt or dismissal. It was something else. Something almost like recognition. Finally he spoke. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much that day. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The question hung in the air. Elena's mouth opened, then closed. She pushed her glasses up her nose with one finger, a nervous habit. When she finally found her voice, it came out barely above a whisper. "My grandmother taught me." Maestro Orlov nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd suspected. "Your grandmother," he repeated. "And she was a violinist?" "Yes, sir." Elena's voice was still quiet but steadier now. She was first violin in the Leningrad Philharmonic. Before the war, before everything changed, something shifted in the maestro's expression. The hard lines around his mouth softened, just slightly. Leningrad. The old name for St. Petersburg. During the war, during the siege, music had been one of the few things that kept people's spirits alive. Orchestras had played in freezing concert halls. Musicians with empty stomachs and numb fingers, performing for audiences who hadn't eaten in days. It had been a different time, a different world. "What was her name?" he asked. "Katerina Morova." Lena said the name with pride, even though her voice shook a little. "She played under conductor Mervinsky. She always said those were the best years of her life, even though they were also the hardest." Maestro Orlov was quiet for a long moment. His eyes looked far away, like he was searching through old memories. Then he shook his head slightly, returning to the present. "After the war, what happened to her?" Elena's shoulders sagged a little. This was the painful part of the story. She lost her position. They said she was too old, but Babushka always thought it was because she'd spoken up about something. She never told me what exactly. After that, no other orchestra would hire her. So she moved to Siberia, to my town. She taught students there. Private lessons, mostly. Nobody famous. Just regular people who wanted to learn. And she taught you? "Yes, sir. From the time I was 4 years old until she died 2 years ago." Elena's voice caught on those last words. 2 years. Sometimes it felt like yesterday. Sometimes it felt like forever. She was very strict. We practiced every day, even when I didn't want to. Even when it was so cold in winter that we had to wear gloves with the fingers cut off. She said the old Russian school wasn't about playing a lot of notes fast. It was about understanding what the music meant. About feeling it here. Alina touched her chest, over her heart. Maestro Orlov watched her face as she spoke. He saw the way her eyes got a little brighter when she talked about her grandmother. The way her whole posture changed, became a little less hunched, a little more proud. This was a girl who'd lost someone important, someone who'd shaped who she was. He understood that kind of loss. Everyone in the music world did. Teachers and students, mentors and protégés. Those relationships ran deeper than family sometimes. The old Russian school, he said quietly, almost to himself. We don't teach that way anymore. It's considered outdated, old-fashioned. Now it's all about technique first, feeling later. About competitions and rankings and building a resume. You looked directly at Alina. But your grandmother taught you the old way? Yes, sir. She had these recordings, old vinyl records from before the war. Heifetz, Oistrakh, Milstein. She made me listen to them over and over. She'd stop the recording and make me play a passage the way they did, till I could match not just the notes, but the emotion. The story behind the notes. She said modern players forgot that music is supposed to say something. It's supposed to make people feel something real. Maestro Orlov crossed his arms over his chest. After your grandmother died, you continued alone. Didn't have a choice. Lena's voice was simple, stating a fact. My parents work in a factory. We don't have money for lessons from other teachers, so I used what babushka taught me. I practiced 8 hours a day, sometimes more. I watched videos online when I could get internet access at the library. I studied the recordings she left me. I tried to remember everything she said, every correction she made, every piece of advice. 8 hours a day? The maestro's eyebrows raised slightly. That's more than most professionals practice. I wanted to honor her memory, sir. She gave up so much. Her career, her position, everything. She spent 40 years teaching in a small town where nobody appreciated what she could do. She deserved to have at least one student who made it, who showed that her way of teaching still mattered. There was a long silence after that. The other judges were still watching from their table, not quite believing this conversation was happening. The remaining candidates in the back had crept forward slightly, trying to hear what was being said. Finally, Maestro Orlov reached out and gently lifted the violin from Elena's hands. She tensed for a moment, instinctively protective, but let him take it. He held it carefully, turning it over, examining it from all angles. He plucked one of the strings lightly and listened to the sound it made. He ran his finger along the repaired crack. This was hers, he said. It wasn't a question.
Yes, sir.
And her aunt's before that. It's been in my family for 3 generations. It's not worth much money, I know. The sound isn't as pure as a new instrument. But it's all I have. It's all she had to give me. Maestro Orlov looked at the violin for another long moment. Then he looked at Alina. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Softer. More human. Do you know what I just heard when you played? Alina shook her head, not trusting her voice. I heard your grandmother. Not just her teaching, but her playing. The way she must have played 70 years ago when she was young and brilliant and the world was opening up before her. I heard decades of knowledge and understanding compressed into 17 years of life. I heard something that we thought was lost. That the old way was dead, that nobody played like that anymore. He handed the violin back to her carefully, like he was returning something precious. You proved us wrong. Maestro Orlov stepped back and looked at Alina for one more moment before turning to face the other judges. When he spoke, his voice carried across the entire hall, clear and firm. We're done for today. Cancel the remaining auditions. The candidates in the back looked at each other in confusion. There were still 8 people waiting to play. The female judge at the table stood up. Victor, we have a schedule. These students traveled from all over the country. Reschedule them, he said simply. I've made my decision. Turned back to Alina, who was standing there looking completely lost, still holding her violin like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. You're accepted. Full scholarship, room and board included. You'll also be joining my advanced mentorship program. I only take 3 students at a time. One spot just opened up. It's yours." Elena's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The violin nearly slipped from her hands. She caught it, clutched it to her chest. What? You'll start next month? We'll arrange your travel from Siberia. You'll need to sort out paperwork with your parents, but the conservatory will handle most of it. We speaking quickly now. Businesslike, as if this was already decided, and they were just working out details. You'll study with me directly 3 times a week. The other days you'll work with our technique specialists and attend ensemble rehearsals. We'll also get you a better instrument. That one has served you well, but you'll need something that can match your skill level. No, the word came out before Alina could stop it. Maestro Orlov raised an eyebrow. It probably wasn't often that someone said no to him. No, he repeated. Alina held the violin tighter. Can't give up my grandmother's violin. It's all I have left of her. It's part of who I am. For the first time since climbing onto the stage, Maestro Orlov smiled. It was small, just a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth, but it changed his entire face. I'm not asking you to give it up. Keep it. Play it when you want to remember her. But for performances, for serious work, you'll need an instrument worthy of your talent. Think of it as honoring her legacy, not replacing it. Alina nodded slowly. That made sense. Babushka would have wanted her to have the best tools available. She'd always said that while the instrument didn't make the musician, a good instrument could help a musician say what they needed to say more clearly. There's one more thing, Maestro Orlov continued. In 3 weeks, I'm conducting a performance at the Rachmaninoff Hall. It's a benefit concert, well attended, lots of important people in the audience. I want you to perform solo, the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. Alina actually took a step backward. Sir, I can't. That's one of the hardest pieces in the repertoire. I've never performed it in front of an audience. I've barely even practiced it all the way through. Then you have 3 weeks to practice it. His tone left no room for argument. I heard what you did with Paganini. You can handle Tchaikovsky. Besides, this isn't a request. Consider it your first assignment as my student. He walked past her then, back toward the judges' table, leaving Alina standing alone on the stage. The other judges were gathering their papers, whispering among themselves. The female judge who'd recorded the performance was already on her phone. She's probably calling someone to share what she'd just witnessed. Alina stood there, holding her violin, trying to process what had just happened. 20 minutes ago, she'd been terrified, certain she was about to be rejected like so many others. Now she was a conservatory student with a full scholarship. Now she was going to study with the most famous violin teacher in Russia. Now she was going to perform at Rachmaninoff Hall in 3 weeks. It was too much. Her head spun. Her legs felt weak. She carefully placed her violin back in its case, her hands shaking as she secured the latches. The other candidates had scattered, some leaving the building entirely, others standing in small groups talking in hushed voices. As Alina walked back, down the aisle toward the exit, carrying her case, a few of them looked at her, not with anger or jealousy, but with something like awe. One girl, probably about Elena's age, gave her a small nod. A gesture of respect, Elena stepped out into the Moscow afternoon. The sun was bright and warm, such a contrast to the dim audition hall. The street was busy with people going about their day, completely unaware that her entire life had just changed. She found a bench and sat down, setting the violin case beside her. For a long time, she just sat there, watching the city move around her. Then, quietly, she started to cry. Not sad tears, not happy tears exactly either. Something in between. Relief and grief and joy and fear all mixed together. She cried for her grandmother, who would never see this moment. She cried for herself, for the scared little girl who'd walked into that audition hall. She cried because it was over and because it was just beginning. The 3 weeks that followed were a blur. Lena went back to her small town in Siberia and told her parents what had happened. Her mother cried. Her father, a quiet man who rarely showed emotion, hugged her so tight she could barely breathe. They filled out forms and made phone calls and packed her belongings into 2 old suitcases. Alina practiced the Tchaikovsky concerto 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. Her fingers developed new calluses. Her bow arm ached constantly. She'd listened to every recording she could find, studying how different violinists approached the piece. At night, she dreamed in music, hearing the melodies even in her sleep. When she arrived back in Moscow and met with Maestro Orlov for her first lesson, he worked her harder than she'd ever been worked before. He stopped her every few measures, making her replay passages until they were exactly right. He talked about phrasing and dynamics in musical architecture. He pushed her to think not just about playing the notes, but about telling a story with them. "Your grandmother gave you the foundation," he told her during one particularly grueling session. "Now we build the house." The night of the concert arrived faster than seemed possible. Alina stood backstage at Rachmaninoff Hall in a simple black dress that the conservatory had provided. It fit better than anything she'd ever owned. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She'd gotten new glasses that actually stayed on her nose. In her hands was a borrowed violin, a beautiful instrument worth more than her family would earn in 10 years. But in her case, resting nearby, was her grandmother's violin. She'd brought it with her. For luck, for courage, for remembrance. The hall was full. Through a gap in the curtain, Alina could see hundreds of people in their seats, talking and laughing, waiting for the performance to begin. Important people, Maestro Orlov had said. Critics and musicians and wealthy patrons of the arts, people whose opinions could make or break a career. Her hands trembled. The old fear came rushing back. What if she forgot a passage? What if she played out of tune? What if she froze up there in front of all those people? What if she disappointed Maestro Orlov? What if she let down her grandmother's memory? Maestro Orlov appeared beside her. He was dressed in formal concert attire, ready to conduct. He looked at her face and seemed to read every thought passing through her mind. "Do you remember what you told me about why you practiced 8 hours a day?" Lena nodded. "To honor my grandmother's memory." "Then stop worrying about the audience. Stop worrying about the critics. Stop worrying about me." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Just play for her, the way you did in that audition hall. Let everything else disappear. The music is what matters. The rest is just noise." He walked away then, heading toward the stage entrance. Lena took a deep breath, then another. She looked down at the violin in her hands, this expensive, perfect instrument. Then she looked at her case, at her grandmother's violin resting inside. Without thinking too hard about it, she made a decision. She put the borrowed violin carefully back in its case and picked up her grandmother's. The familiar weight of it in her hands, the worn smoothness of the wood, the slight imperfections that she knew by heart. This was right. This was honest. This was who she was. She heard her cue, the opening notes of the orchestra, setting up her entrance. Alina walked onto the stage, carrying her grandmother's scarred violin with the repaired crack and the peeling stickers. The audience fell silent, hundreds of faces turning toward her. The stage lights were bright and hot. She raised the violin to her chin, found her position, and waited for the exact right moment. Then, just as she had in the audition, she began to play. Softly at first, quietly, like sharing a secret, but this time, she knew what came next. She knew that the quiet beginning would build into something powerful, that the nervousness would fade away and leave only the music, that her grandmother's hands would guide her own across time and distance and death itself. And as the first phrase lifted into the air, filling the concert hall with sound, Alina smiled. Just a little. Just enough. 'Cause she knew, somehow, that Babushka was listening. That she'd been listening all along. That every note Alina had ever played, every hour of practice, every moment of doubt and triumph, had been building toward this. The quiet girl from Siberia had finally found her voice, and the world was beginning to hear it.